So just want to make sure that everybody is seeing the title slide. If you're not, then put something in the chat or tell somebody. So tonight we're going to talk about cueing with disabilities other than deafness. And I want to just start by talking a little bit about what's beneficial about cued speech. I mean, we all know about it and use it for communication and things, but there are certain aspects of cued speech that make it particularly helpful for a range of concerns other than just being deaf. The biggest thing about cued speech is it makes phonemes concrete and unambiguous, so that it's not just that it's clear, but that it's something that you can literally hold in your hand, that is, you know, something that you can see and feel and touch when you're cueing. It allows us to hold phonemes indefinitely. So there's only so long, even if you're the best singer on the earth, there's only so long you can hold an ah. With cueing, you can hold an ah forever. And that has particular benefits for a number of disabilities. It also allows you to put phonemes on paper. You can take digital photographs of cues and print them so that you can actually have the sounds of spoken language on paper. It separates phonemes from graphemes, so the letters and the sounds can be separated, and that's really, really important for a lot of reasons. It also directs attention to the face and mouth, which those are important areas for many aspects of spoken language. It requires very little visual tracking. Yes, you have to track within the cueing space, but that's a much more restricted area than the sign space, so that there's a lot less movement going on that someone that has problems with eye tracking has to manage. It allows for physically guided practice of phonemes. So if someone is having trouble with phonemes, you can hand on hand them and, you know, give them the sh, so that you can actually physically guide them to the phoneme that you're targeting. It identifies the target phonemes of for speech practice, so that if, for example, my son frequently mispronounces things, and when he does, I can fix that just by cueing what he's trying to say, and he can follow that guidance. And finally, it allows for the monitoring of phonology versus articulation, so that if a child is trying to read something, you need to know whether they're decoding it incorrectly or just saying it incorrectly. So lots of kids have difficulty producing z or some of the voiced phonemes. So if they say roses instead of roses, you need to know, are they misdecoding it or simply misarticulating it? With cueing, you can do that. You just have to watch what they're cueing instead of listening to what they're saying. So those are benefits of cued speech that apply much more broadly than just with the deaf population. And phoneme analysis is hard for a lot of people, not just children too, but it requires very minute differences in sounds to be understood. And so this is a problem that's present in a lot of disabilities, learning disabilities, reading disabilities, troubles with phonemes. Intellectual disabilities often have trouble with phoneme discrimination. Auditory processing, speech, language impairment, specific language impairment, autism spectrum, speech production problems, a whole wide range of issues have trouble with phoneme discrimination. You know, but by making the phonemes visually discrete, separating them very clearly, that supports the language development, which in turn supports literacy development. So that's a really major benefit for a wide range of issues. And like I said, you can hold a cue forever. Cues are not ephemeral. Speech is very ephemeral. It's there and it's immediately gone. But cues can be held as long as the listener needs the cue. So if someone is slow processing, whether it's auditory or visual, by holding that information longer, you can make it available for them to process in their own time. Also, the person, the adult, or the person cueing can point to. Sometimes my son will focus on my lips and not on my hand, and he'll get the wrong phoneme, and I'm like, that one, so that you can point out to prompt the correct phoneme. And again, digital photographs of cues can be printed on worksheets and paired with with wrappings, with letters, to let students practice that important grapheme phoneme association in their own time, at their own speed, without time pressure. And you can have sequences of photos that are paired with pictures of objects and letters to present language information. So, again, as everybody knows, cues represent phonemes, not graphemes. So no matter what phoneme, what grapheme you're going to use, k is always k. So it's always presented by hand shape 2, and the mouth shape, regardless of which grapheme, K, CK, C, CH, whatever, it doesn't matter. It's always the same phoneme. Similarly, individual phonemes can be represented by a wide range. One phoneme can be, the same grapheme can be represented by multiple phonemes too. So CH can be ch, but it can also be k, because we don't say stool, we say school. So you have a way to completely separate these that isn't really available any other way. So we know that cued speech has a variety of advantages for deaf children, and I'm just going to zoom through this. But it's an effective means of communication, and it develops English vocabulary and grammar. Okay, it lets hearing parents communicate without having to simplify their vocabulary or language, and it lets them read books with nonsense words, which are really important for practicing those sound skills. And research has supported its benefits for language and literacy development in deaf children. But those aren't the only people that it can be helpful for. There are lots of reasons that children have trouble learning language, and language is necessary for literacy. So if you enhance language development, you're going to enhance literacy development. Auditory processing disorders are a common issue. Learning disabilities, specific language impairment, and again, intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum, vision and visual processing issues, movement of the eyes, things like that, other speech language disorders, just lots of things. One of the areas that's a really important thing to think about is auditory processing, because problems with auditory processing are the key in the language issues with a lot of those other disorders. So children with severe auditory processing disorders may actually present as functionally deaf. Yes, they pass the pure tone average tests. They can hear, but they can't process, they can't analyze the sounds adequately. Milder auditory processing disorders may make the child look more hard of hearing. Either way, we know that both deaf and hard of hearing children benefit from cued speech. And cued speech has actually been used for communication and literacy development with significant auditory processing disorders. You know, it can be used just like it's being used with a deaf child for providing access to communication, language, grammatical markers. A lot of times kids with auditory processing issues may have trouble with specific sounds that can be like s and d and t, that are important for possessives, plurals, tenses, things like that. And cueing is really critical for those kinds of things. If you've got a kid that may be more able to manage without it, it's still critical for new vocabulary and important concepts, times when the child is not as on task. But the great thing about cued speech is because it enhances the language and sound analysis, it actually teaches the brain how to analyze the sounds, then the child tends to function better even when cueing is not available, if they're cued to regularly early on. So, you know, and if a child misperceives a word or mispronounces the word, it can be used to clarify. And it's awesome for dictation and for like spelling tests, absolutely critical. Reading programs are readily supported using cued speech. So any reading program can be presented as if it's being presented to a hearing kid or a kid without an auditory processing disorder, simply by having the benefit of cueing. There are some really interesting special auditory processing disorders. I'm just going to talk about a couple of them quickly. One is Landau-Kleffner syndrome, which is a rare seizure disorder which causes an epilepsy-related auditory processing issue that causes a language issue, an aphasia. The language basically disappears as it's being developed. And research has actually been done with kids with Landau-Kleffner's, and it was determined that visual cues are critical in supporting those kids to maintain the language information that the brain is processing. For some reason, the auditory system is disrupted and the visual system is relatively intact, so that cued speech can support the language development in kids with Landau-Kleffner's, and it's actually specifically mentioned in some Landau-Kleffner syndrome materials, which I thought was awesome. When I found those materials that specifically said cued speech for these kids, that was amazing. It's also associated, another type of specific auditory processing disorder is one that's related to Knickler syndrome, that it's a neurotoxicity, like when the kids get jaundice at birth. Okay, that can produce this syndrome if it's not adequately treated right away. And again, this results in an auditory neuropathy and auditory processing issue. And again, cued speech is beneficial in these cases. moving to specific language impairment, specific language impairment, historically, a deaf kid has been excluded, deaf kids have been excluded from this diagnosis because it's supposed to be with an unexpected lack of language development, despite appropriate stimulation, normal intelligence, and an intact sensory system. But very clearly, in research and clinical practice over the years, deaf kids also can have language impairments, specific language impairments. But anyway, there's a lot of research that says that the problem underlying many forms of specific language impairment is a problem with auditory processing, okay? And this is also thought to be one of the key underlying issues in autism spectrum disorder with associated language impairment. The current spectrum includes kids who don't have your typical language impairment, all the way through the kids who are completely nonverbal, but auditory processing issues have been identified as being key for both of these kinds of disabilities. And there may be different kinds of auditory processing problems in different types of autism, as well as in different types of language impairments. One of the most common issues with auditory processing in children with specific language impairment is problems with discriminating rapid phonemes. That phonemes are very, very similar and they're very fast. So the differences between a duh and a tuh, or a buh and a puh, are in the matters of milliseconds, thousandths of seconds. And again, we can make that concrete and visually clear with cues and hold it longer if necessary. Language impairment and in autism spectrum is again, thought to relate to some forms of auditory processing. And interestingly, research with visual tracking shows that kids with autism spectrum disorder focus on the mouth and the neck area instead of the eyes. Most children, have that eye-to-eye contact, but children with autism have difficulty with that eye-to-eye contact, but focus on the mouth and the neck area, which just happens to be where cueing happens. So that really makes cueing ideal. Furthermore, individuals with autism spectrum disorder tend to shift their gaze less often, so they don't look from one person to the next as readily. So when you have multiple speakers, having a transliterator there can make life much more accessible for them. Children with autism spectrum disorder often have deficits in facial recognition. They don't tend to analyze faces in the same way that typical individuals do. And again, cued speech focuses the attention on the face and helps to enhance that skill. Research actually supports the use of visual phonemic cues to support speech production in children with autism spectrum disorder. This research didn't actually look at cued speech, but it did look at other visual cues. And with cued speech, you not only have those visual cues to help with speech production and speech perception, but it provides a communication system to support their needs. I've actually, had people report that it helped individuals with autism, even when they're not deaf. So phonological awareness, that's critical for literacy. And children with auditory processing disorders, whether it's a standalone disorder part of an intellectual disability, part of a learning disability, part of an autism spectrum disorder, all of those tend to have difficulty with phonemic awareness. So again, cueing can be used to help with these skills, because if you can't discriminate but or puh from puh or eh from eh, then you're not going to be able to learn to decode text. And it's going to make understanding words difficult, because pit and pet might be the same word to the listener. So the cueing, as it does with deaf kids, disambiguates these minimal pairs, these phoneme pairs that are hard to discriminate. All oral phoneme awareness activities can be readily performed using cued speech. The absolute only adaptation needed is for the person to guiding the practice to cue. Okay, the cueing automatically clarifies the auditory signal, whether it's an ambiguous auditory signal itself because of a hearing issue, or whether it's a processing issue in the brain. There are also special situations like second language learners. So English as a second language learner, they may have difficulty discriminating phonemes from English, because during those early babbling years, some of the phonemes that we use in English weren't part of their native language, so they were deleted basically from the practice. So they didn't learn to discriminate those, and cueing can clarify those as well. So in some respects, these kids are kind of like kids with auditory processing disorders, because they're limited in analyzing specific phonemes that were not part of their native language, that now they need to learn, their brain needs to learn how to process it. And by making that clear using visual cues, the brain can then be taught that yes, these two phonemes aren't the same thing. L and R are not the same phoneme. So all of the supports used for auditory processing can be used for these kinds of issues as well. Cued speech can also help with developing speech skills. A lot of people, it's funny, and over the years, I've had a lot of people that misunderstood cued speech and thought that it should just be used for speech therapy, because it was to help them kids with speech. And it's like, well, it does help with speech, but that's not the goal. The goal is communication and literacy. But it does help, because you can often, the problems with speech production are a problem with speech discrimination. So if you can't discriminate the sound, you don't know what to produce. Other times, problems with speech production are like oral motor sequencing. So the mouth is getting confused. Fortunately, cueing can help both of these. Cueing directly supports issues with phoneme discrimination, because if the kid can't hear whether the person is saying Matt or Pat, you cue it and they can see what it is. And that can help develop the appropriate speech. But also for the dyspraxic child, the child whose mouth just has trouble moving the right way, the impact is less direct, but cueing focuses on the mouth and slows things down. And that's really important. Slowing down the child who's having speech production issues is really important to help them produce the appropriate sequence. And also, if the child cues expressively, that motor sequencing can be supported through the cueing. So, and I see this in action. And what I see is speech skills often spontaneously improve with cued speech. And what's really interesting is if the people around the kid are not cueing, their speech may decline. And if the people start cueing, their speech may improve. And if they themselves start cueing, their speech tends to improve even more. So they pronounce words better, both when they are cued to and when they themselves cue. And the other thing is, if their speech is hard to understand, then if they cue expressively, that can help if the other person can read their cues. So learning disabilities, how does cued speech help with learning disabilities? Well, it specifically helps with reading disabilities. Phonological dyslexia or sound analysis problems dyslexia is the most common type of dyslexia. There are other types, but developmentally, problems with analyzing phonemes is the most common issue in dyslexias. And this is related to auditory processing issues. If you have visual access to phonology, i.e. cued speech, that allows the child to be able to learn the accurate, precise phonemes and develop those phonemic awareness and decoding skills, in addition to all of the other aspects of language that are important for literacy. And it provides access to information about the world, which is also critical for that top-down analysis of text. When they're reading, it helps them to understand. Even if they don't know every word, they can get the gist. And because they have world knowledge, they can understand what's being said or what they're reading. So cued speech is used with children with severe auditory processing disorders and learning disabilities to support language and literacy development, and it is effective in that process. There's less information available on cued speech with individuals with intellectual disabilities, but there is some, and it was really cool to find research, 2 studies with cued Persian with children with intellectual disabilities, and they use cueing to support language and communication development as well as reading skills. And one of the things that the research said was it really helps that cues make phonemes both unique and concrete. Okay, and so a quote that I really like from one of the papers is, according to our results, teaching cued speech to children with educable intellectual disability improves their phonological skills and prevents communication problems associated with reading. So that's a pretty important statement. In the studies, they reported a variety of benefits. Those included, as noted before, correcting pronunciation. You can correct the pronunciation by cueing and showing what they're supposed to be trying to pronounce. It increased vocabulary, and we know that from working with deaf children, that if you're cued to regularly, you get more vocabulary development. Improved receptive and expressive language in these children with the intellectual disabilities, and it improved their reading abilities. And those are really, really important benefits for children that most people wouldn't think of cueing to. So, back to advantages of cued speech. Well, when decoding, if we want to not just have language, we want to have literacy, you have to match the sounds that they've decoded from text. So you've got C-A-T, K-A-T, cat. But if you don't have that dictionary in your head of the phonemic sequences that represent that word, it doesn't help. When you're cued to regularly, you develop these dictionaries in your head of words as they are phonemically sequenced. You know, if you're hearing, you've got this sound-based dictionary in your head of what words sound like. And that sound-based dictionary is connected to meaning. okay? If you learn to decode, but you don't have that sound-based dictionary in your head, then you're not able to readily attach to meaning. But with regular cueing in conversational interactions, that massive exposure, repeated exposure of those phonemic sequences through the visual mode lets the person know, okay, that sound sequence is attached to this meaning. Okay, so when they decode, if they have that, they can do that direct attached to meaning through that. Oh, this sequence of phonemes, this sequence of graphemes is this sequence of phonemes, is this meaning. Okay, so if you know k-a-t equals cat, unless you have that internal dictionary that includes that phonemic sequence of cat and attaches it to meaning, that's a problem. Most reading programs, research, there's been a lot of research on reading for hearing kids. And research really supports multi-sensory phonics approach to reading. And this is especially important for the 40% of children who struggle to learn to read. Okay, about 40% will learn regardless of how they're taught. And about 40% are going to struggle unless they're taught using this phonemic decoding process. And then 20% can get by with sort of lesser programming. But this is important, not just for single word decoding. Single word decoding by itself is not reading. You have to have reading comprehension. And this multisensory decoding process is important for both reading comprehension and decoding. And the cool thing is, intrinsically, you know, cueing is multisensory. Cueing is visual, it's tactile, it's kinesthetic, so movement based. But this is important because this isn't, multisensory reading is important for not just children, but also for adult English language learners. So even if you've got someone who is older and they're struggling with reading, cueing can support that. Phonemes are multisensory. Phonemes are not just sounds. Okay, speech perception is multisensory. Okay, phonemes are perceived using the visual and not just with cues. Everybody uses speech reading to support their language intake, their auditory intake. But it's also perceived through the tactile and motor functions in the throat, so that even people who read silently are making micro movements in their throat and using that feedback to decode what they're reading. And so it uses a wide range of sensory input to help us understand what we are decoding. And using multisensory information like that, visual, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic, can help with the speech perception and learning speech. And the motor system is involved in the perception of phonemes. There's actual work that shows that if you move the mouth a different way while the person's trying to read something, it's going to change what they are perceiving. So if you have deficits in multisensory integration, trying to combine that visual, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic information, that contributes to problems with language and speech perception. And that is one of the areas that's problematic for both children with autism and children with language and specific language impairments. So multisensory integration is important. Cued speech is multisensory and enhances, through practice, multisensory integration. So if there is residual hearing, or if the child has typical hearing, or if the child has hearing but they have an auditory processing disorder, the visual cues, and if they cue for themselves, the tactile and kinesthetic movement-based cues can integrate with that limited signal or that dysfunctional signal to enhance the interpretation not only of the cues, but also of that other either degraded or poorly analyzed signal. So it provides a range of feedback that can help set up that internal dictionary, that internal model of the phonology, so that they have that sound-based lexicon, but it's not just sound, it's phonemes. It's phonemes that are visual, auditory, tactile, kinesthetic, the whole thing. And that dictionary in their head integrates all of that information so that when they're trying to access the meaning from what they're either hearing or trying to read, they have all of those cues. The more cues you have, the more likely you are to accurately decode incoming information. Okay, so, and the other thing is the consonant vowel pairing, the fact that we put the consonants at the vowel placements really sets up for transition from letter by letter decoding to the blending of sounds. The ability to separate the letters from the phonemes lets us do that discrimination that oo can be spelled many different ways. Oo can be spelled EW, UE, OO, and OO can be oo or So that separation of the graphemes and phonemes lets us be able to see that, yes, you know, sometimes C is pronounced K as in cake, and other times C is pronounced S as in city, you know. And that's a critical aspect of learning sounds. And so even children with autism spectrum disorder, with auditory processing disorders, with intellectual disabilities, with a wide range of disabilities, when they're presented with consistent access to visual communication using cued speech, can develop these sounding out skills and also have developed that dictionary in their head of how words are phonemically structured. And this also lets a kid come up against a word that they haven't seen in print before, but maybe they've heard or seen cued repeatedly. So they decode it and they go, ooh, I attach it to that meaning. So any standard phonics-based program can be used with a kid with auditory processing disorders, intellectual disabilities, autism spectrum disorders, you know, all of these disabilities that have blocks to language and literacy based on analyzing sounds simply by adapting through the use of cued speech. And interestingly, a lot of these programs have pictures that they encourage the child to use to identify phonemes, like the Linda Bell has, you know, pictures of the lip shapes and things like that. Well, cues, you've already got those. They're the cues. So you know, you can use the digital photographs of cues to keep the cues on paper even. But you can also use them in running speech, which you can't do with visual phonics or with Linda Bell pictures of the lips and things like that. So all of the things that you're studying to try and relate those phonemes that they're using other methods of making concrete, you can make concrete with cues, and you can do it through the airflow communication. And again, this was 25 years ago, I developed a phonics program for my son who didn't have language, but I made digital photographs of cues on paper, and part of how he learned language was learning to decode on paper. And anybody can do this now. I mean, this was back when digital cameras were rare. Now everybody's got their phone so that they can do it. So that if you have cues on paper, then you can have paper and pencil practice so that you can present sheets with the phonemes, the phonemes sequence, and they can write in the letters underneath to decode. And that way they can do massed practice and practice without having to try to catch the phonemes as they're rushing past their head. So when a kid writes letters to match a string of digitally presented cued phonemes, they're basically writing to dictation. But that's writing to dictation without the time constraints of doing it through the air. Okay, and most of these kids need that extended processing time. And kids with intellectual disabilities, slow processors. Kids with auditory processing difficulties tend to have slow auditory processing. Kids with autism spectrum disorders often have a need for extended processing time. So, all of these guys, this extended processing time makes it possible for them to not only analyze the cues as long as they need to, so that they can take as much time as they need to discriminate these phonemes. They can also look back or have cheat sheets to like having the cue posters on your wall when you're learning to cue. So you're like and check it out. Well, they can do this with spreadsheets or cheat sheets of phonemes and graphemes, so that this allows to have that grapheme phoneme association development at their own pace. And repeated practice with the worksheets can not only teach them the sound symbol relationships, so that the phoneme letter relationships, but you can teach words this way. So you can have them with the phonemes presented. You can have it with the phonemes presented in the sequence, and then you can have the consonant vowel pairs. And my t got, oops, sorry. My t somehow got lost there, but that would be ha, t. So that they can actually learn what the word looks like phonemically through the air, at the same time that they're learning the meaning and what it looks like in print. And for some kids, that's the best way for them to learn language, is on paper. Now, one other aspect of cueing is that if a kid has poor speech articulation, they have trouble producing the sounds, and you want to know, are they decoding well? You can actually monitor their reading by listening to their cues rather than their speech. So, you may not know if it's a decoding issue or a speech production issue. My eye is missing. So if they have limited speech intelligibility, just have oral reading with the child cueing expressively, and you can figure out, is this a problem with how they're decoding, or is it just a speech production issue? Because if it's a speech production issue, that's no big deal. I mean, yes, we want them to be able to have the best speech possible, but they're reading correctly, and that's more important. They have the correct language in their head. And, if they never develop awesome speech production, they can still be highly functioning, highly literate And if they have a transliterator, they can be understood too. Okay, so you know, you can correct errors in decoding if you know that it's a decoding issue, and you can work on the speech production skills if you know it's a speech production issue. And that allows us to separate those two issues. So, tips for cueing with kids with disability. Cue slowly. This is really important. I've worked for years to cue faster and discovered over time that actually with my son, it was better to cue more slowly because in addition to being deaf, he had a language disorder. So he needed that extra processing time. And a lot of kids with a lot of different disabilities need that extra processing time. Use short, simple phrases and allow time between each phrase for processing. Because these kids often are replaying this stuff in their head to try to figure out what was actually said. You need to monitor their attention. This is exhausting. This is, I mean, watching a transliterator or an interpreter is exhausting anyway. But if you're doing this and you've got an additional challenge to analyzing incoming language, it's super exhausting. So listening is really hard and fatigue makes it harder. So you have to make sure that, and if their attention is waning, maybe it's time for a break rather than you need to pay attention, okay? Because their attention may be getting worse because they just don't have any left. They don't have any cognitive resources left. So they're going to be less able to compensate for their difficulties. If possible, consider presenting cues in a static form on paper, as well as through the air, especially for new vocabulary. Everybody has digital cameras now, everybody. There's no reason we can't have cues on paper to support comprehension and practice. And this lets the kids rehearse these things in their own time. New vocabulary and new information should be reviewed regularly until it's clearly mastered and then reviewed intermittently, because sometimes these kids' language seems like it's somebody writing on a blackboard and somebody coming up behind them erasing it. So even when it seems like they may have mastered what they were learning, it's really important to review it for retention, to make sure that it doesn't just fall through the sand. So, take-home message. Cued speech can work for kids with lots of challenges to language and literacy, even if they're hearing. You know, deaf, hearing, doesn't matter. But you need to work with their strengths, which are often static visual analysis and visual supports for their auditory processing, and find ways to remediate and accommodate their weaknesses, which are often rapid analysis and auditory analysis. You know, and accuracy is more important than speed. And in fact, sometimes it's better to be slower and just cue it. And I can't believe it. It's not 8 o'clock and I am done. So now we can go ahead and do the questions. I have, I'll make a PDF of the handout for the PowerPoint. And in addition to the references, I've got some resources. And also I have a little bit more information on developing cueing on paper for reading programs. So questions. Now, I think people were going to put questions in the chat room. And Scott, are you going to read the questions, or is somebody going to read the questions? Or people put hands up?
I can read the questions. I'm just checking the chat right now to see if we have any. I'm not seeing any. If anyone has questions, now would be the time. If you'd like to put them in the chat. Thank you very much. It looks like we have one question. Her daughter has auditory limitations and she has not learned how to cue. She can work with me how can she work with me to learn? She is 14.
Okay, perfect situation, because you can learn to cue and your daughter can learn to cue. And if you have cues on paper, then again, that can help with both of you learning how to cue. Again, I learned how to cue by with an old-fashioned VHS videotape and sitting on the floor with chunky books and cueing them with the cueing posters on my walls in every room. So, you know, there are great online cue classes that are good for learning how to cue, and she can actively learn to cue. One of the best ways to learn to cue is to go to a cue camp. And there's one coming up in Virginia in 3 weeks. But you don't have to go to cue camp anymore because there are online cueing classes. And 14-year-olds can learn to cue just as well as you know, little kids. My stepdaughter was 12 when Thomas was 1 year old, and we went to our first cue camp, and she came with us and cued better than her dad at the end of the cue camp. So I strongly encourage you to give it a try, to sign up for online cue classes, to do what you can.
If someone cannot attend a cue camp, that's right, the online classes can be an excellent way to learn as well. It was suggested maybe that we turn off the presentation so that people can see you more.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, so I'm going to end the slideshow for me too, so that I can
Okay.
see it too.
We've had some great comments in the chat. I really appreciate that you're sending all of these. I'm sure Donna does as well. Lots of compliments, which is really appreciated. Is there any specific questions that anyone has for Donna still? I just want to be sure we don't miss anyone.
Oh, I can see the chat now that I've stopped my queuing on my screen. Yes, take the 101 course with your kid. I mean, she can take the course too. So, you know, try it. If you can't travel, that's not a problem. Thank God for online resources now. I mean, literally, when I learned how to cue in 1993, I was watching a VHS videotape and sitting on my floor with chunky books and posters on my walls. So absolutely, you know, the online courses are excellent, and there are also lots of YouTube videos, cue reading videos to practice. That Facebook has a lot of cueing stuff. So you can actually access all sorts of supports for learning to cue online now.
We have another question in the chat. Can you see it? It's from HK.
Let's be further down. Let me see if I can.
I can read it if that'd be easier.
Yeah, would you mind?
Sure. What elements are required for an appropriate phonics program in dyslexia advocacy? Often systems/districts use inappropriate curriculums and interventions. For a more intense focus on phonemic awareness, what should parents look for?
Well, you know, there's a there's an online, not warehouse, it's an online resource for what reading programs work. It's based on national research, and that's one thing you can go to look and see what reading programs have been well researched. But a phonics program should start with a limited set of phonemes being associated with a limited set of graphemes. So limited set of sounds and letters being trained and rehearsed until those get to be fluid, and then continuing adding those while practicing the original ones until the point at which the kids develop what's called automaticity, so that they see the letter and that phoneme pops up into their head, whether it's a visual phoneme or an auditory phoneme or an integrated multisensory phoneme. So, you know, these are very stepwise programs. And that's the thing that you should especially look for, is a stepwise, systematic introduction of sequences of phonemes with ongoing rehearsal and relationship to words that rapidly moves to running print.
We have another question, and we're just at 1 hour here, so we'll probably wrap up soon. My son is 21 and has auditory neuropathy spectrum disorder. He was diagnosed at 2.5. I started to cue with him back then. He's now in college as cute speech transliterator on his laptop for all of his classes. Dr. Berlin from New Orleans at the time is who encouraged me to use cute speech. I will be eternally grateful. My son is bilaterally implanted with cochlear implants and speaks fluent English.
Yeah, Dr. Berlin was actually the discoverer of basically of auditory neuropathy, and was an early adopter of cued speech for intervention for auditory neuropathies. So we have a whole lot to thank Dr. Berlin for. He was for auditory neuropathy what Dr. Cornett was for cute speech in many ways. So yeah, thank you for that comment. Yeah. I've worked with some kids who had auditory neuropathy, as well as kids with auditory processing disorders, and cute speech is pretty much the only way to go for those kids, particularly with auditory neuropathy, even more so than standard auditory processing disorders. In fact, some forms of auditory neuropathy, you don't even have an auditory nerve, so that the implants won't work. I worked with one kid with that, but because of cued speech being used at home and at school, she was fluent in English. So, you know, it can bypass pretty much any auditory issue.
Thank you so much for that comment. It looks like we've exhausted all of the questions. Donna, we would really like to thank you for the presentation this evening. We had a really good participation and lots of good questions, and we really appreciate that you take the time to, you've taken the time this evening to present this topic to all the supporters of the NCSA.
Well, it's my pleasure. I love to talk about these things, and you know, now that I am retired, I have more time to be able to do this kind of thing.
And a special thanks to Angela and Francis for transliterating tonight. We really appreciate all the support, and especially to our participants. Thanks so much for joining us. This was recorded, so we will turn it around into a video that will be on our YouTube channel probably within a few weeks. If anyone missed it and would like to watch it again.
Yeah, and I'm going to be sending the PDF of the handouts so that should be available as well with the recording.
Great. We'll go ahead and send that out too. Thank you so much.